Hello, so talking about the Windrush scandal. So back in 2014, we all started hearing about the Windrush scandal. Basically, it's when the government had decided to start checking the Caribbean, well, British people's documents, who are originally from the Caribbean or their parents have been through the Caribbean. So they were checking their rights of being in Britain. It's hard to explain because these people were British, but they had come over when they were very young with the belief that they were a British citizen. They did not have to have documents and things like that, just like any other British person living in Britain does. Some of these people had been in Britain since the 1940s, or more likely a little later, but Britain had called for people to help build Britain back up after the war in 1948. So they were advertising Welcome Caribbean People to Britain from 1948, and they needed about 1.5 million people, and they were really desperate for help. So 1948 is when the first boat came over, but before the first boat had left the Caribbean, there was an urgent message from the British government office in Jamaica that was sent to the colonial office in Whitehall. It read, "I regret to inform you that more than 350 troop deck passengers by Empire Windrush have been booked by men who hope to find employment in the United Kingdom, and that is likely that this number will be increased by another 100 before the vessel leaves. Most of them have no particular skill, and few will have more than a few pounds on their arrival." Now, there is a document that shows that on the first boat on the 22nd of June 1948, there were actually 85 mechanics, 54 carpenters, 39 clerks, 23 welders, 20 engineers, 15 mechanists, 14 fitters, and 13 electricians. Remember, these people were leaving their families, so it wasn't just as simple as leaving to get work for themselves. It wasn't as easy as that, like some people seem to believe. Now, this was one boat coming over, and yet there was a panic being put in place that they were going to be sort of taken over. It was actually labelled as an incursion, which basically means an invasion. Now, it was completely fabricated and it was completely uncalled for. It was one boat, and they were coming over because they were being called for by Britain. Now, they were even considering to divert that boat to East Africa to pick peanuts. Now, if they had been white people, it would have been a different story, and this is why. So, Operation Westward Home, 180,000 migrants who had no links to Britain, who mostly had no links to Britain, unlike the Caribbean people did from war and being in the Commonwealth. So, who either they spoke no English or very little, had no skills to bring with them to help build Britain back up. They were called the EVWs, which is the European Volunteer Workers. Now, they were coming from places like Italy, the Balkans, Yugoslavia, and there were ethnic Germans and ex-prisoners of war of Germany and Ukraine. Thousands of them were former members of the Waffen SS regiment. So they had previously been against Britain, but they were being favoured over the Caribbean people who were helping Britain. And the reason being, because they were white. And what's even more insulting is a few months after they had arrived, it was announced that they would be given indefinite stay and allowed to, I quote, intermarry and be accepted in our own working population. Now, another sad statement in a document was, "Whatever may be the policy about British citizenship, I do not think that any scheme for the importation of coloured colonials for permanent settlement here should be embarked upon without full understanding that this means that a coloured element will be brought in for permanent absorption into our own population." Okay. There were 11 Labour MPs who had written a letter to the Prime Minister revealing what the Windrush generation were up against. And that was a picture of it, basically saying lots are going to come to Britain to claim shelter and social services, and others will follow because it's an easy way of life, and that an influx of coloured people will likely impair harmony, strength, and cohesion of public and social life and cause unhappiness. It was becoming harder for those coming over to get accommodation, because even though they had money to pay, some were sleeping on streets and being denied jobs that they had the skills for because of the untrue stories being told. So when Winston Churchill led the Conservatives into power in 1951, there were around 3,000 Caribbean people every year that were going into Britain. The black population was about 40 to 50,000. Now, Churchill complained about not being taken notice of about immigration. A file labelled "The Immigration of Coloured Workers to Britain" revealed his what I would call obsession with it. It was this tatty old book that he had kept pushing onto the government's agenda, like the cuttings of stories from newspapers which would highlight something that had happened that would involve black people or Indian people or whoever. Just something to draw attention to it. Now, a subject he brought up at a cabinet meeting was about whether a post office was employing higher numbers of coloured employees, and if so, there was some risk of difficult social, meaning racial problems. Now, the post office master replied with around 500 employees were coloured, which he then replied that between 5 and 600 was a considerable amount, so he exaggerated the numbers as well. In 1952, a letter, there's a picture of it here, stating, "It is felt that coloured workers should not be allowed to obtain employment in this country. I should have thought that the proper course would be to deny them to entry into this country." Please pause the video to read the full document. It then goes on to say it raises the whole issue of whether coloured subjects of the Commonwealth and Empire should be admitted to the country from now on, and whether those who are already here should be discharged not only by the post office but by the rest of the civil service. So the people in the Commonwealth who were white and from places like Canada, for example, were not part of it. So it wasn't a case of people so-called invading Britain, but the so-called problem of black people. And that was it. There's no way anybody can argue with that. That is the piece of evidence. I mean, it was racial. And can I just say, I really dislike using the word coloured and colour. I'm just reading it how it is, but I'm really uncomfortable even just saying that. Now, in the Caribbean, they didn't really have an idea of what was being spoken about in the Houses of Parliament, so people still believed that they were being welcomed and it was a good place to go and get work and become something and help and be part of something that was good. And they weren't afraid of work, so let's be very clear on that. They were getting hands on with things. Now, by this time, people were coming over on planes, and the government was really watching them closely. Now, Britain couldn't admit publicly to being racist, so they used like loopholes and things. So they set an interdepartmental working group, which was basically meaning lots of departments working together, employing senior civil servants. They were asked to obtain facts and figures to prove the arrival of coloured people in Britain was a problem. Now, they were insinuating that most were scroungers with no intention to work. The document held no evidence to back them statements up, and every single one actually did have a job. Now, in 1953, the Working Party requested dole officers to take part in a secret race survey of people claiming benefits, and it was an absolute secret. Now, this was done in just 2 weeks after Queen Elizabeth had taken the throne. Now, the working group took the opinions of constables in big cities, asking for assessments of inequalities and characters of the black communities. So this was the black communities now. Now, they asked if it was true if they were generally idle and poor workmen, had low standards of living, lived under bad conditions, addicted to drug trafficking or other types of crime, and they were hoping to find some criminal activity and scroungers basically. But once again, there was no evidence of this whatsoever. They came for work and they were damn good workers. They could not find anything wrong with them. So the British businesses were trying to get more people to come in and work, and they needed workers, and the NHS had actually dispatched a junior health minister called Enoch Powell to Barbados to recruit nurses, claiming the mother country needed them. Women were leaving their children to come and work as nurses because they were being told they were needed. Some never knew their parents because they left them when they were so young, and they wanted to help Britain, earn money and help their families back home. Once again, leaving their families would not have been an easy thing to do, like lots of people seem to think. Now, a statement was put out in 1954 where 10,000 West Indies came to Britain. In 1955, it is believed another 15,000 will make the long journey, but one point must always be borne in mind. Whatever our feelings, we cannot deny them entry, for all are British citizens and as such are entitled to the identical rights of any member of the Empire. In 1968 in Birmingham, a conference was being held by the same guy who went over to request nurses from Barbados to go to Britain. He said, it almost passes belief that at this moment 20 to 30 additional immigrant children are arriving from overseas in Wolverhampton alone every week, and he demanded them to be manned and actually wanted to send them back. Now, going back a bit, in 1948, Labour was government. The British Nationality Act of 1948 reaffirmed the British rights that existed for centuries, confirming the freedom of British people to move around where they like, as a British subject or as a Commonwealth citizen. So whether white, Asian or black, it meant everybody in the Commonwealth had equal rights under Act 48. But it was actually really to allow the white people's freedom from places like Canada and New Zealand and others with minimal hassle of having to produce documents and things, but they didn't really mean it for others like African, West Indian and Asian people. So now forward again, 1971, which was under the Conservatives' law, set limits on broad defining on Britishness and had been in place since 1948 under the Nationality Act. But under the new Act, all Commonwealth citizens who had arrived in Britain before it came in and that had deemed leave to live in the UK. The small print, however, stated, when any question arises under this Act whether or not a person is partial or is entitled to any exemption under this Act, it shall lie on the person asserting it to prove that he is. So, if that person was working that day and he was a racist or she was a racist and wanted somebody out, they would have the power to say, no, you don't have enough evidence, you can just go. We're gonna try and get you out of this country. So now in 2014, under Theresa May's or Conservatives' power, it was announced that they wanted to ensure that only legal immigrants would be able to obtain housing, banking, and access to the NHS. So it became a legal requirement for documents to be produced. So, landlords were legally having to check for documents to prove tenants' rights of being in the UK. Employers were having to do the same. So, these people who had originally been told that they're British citizens and may not have had appropriate documents because they weren't needed back then were suddenly having to provide them. So, children who had come over at a very young age and had been in Britain basically their whole life had to suddenly prove it, even though they had been to school in Britain, got qualifications, had worked their whole adult life, paid their taxes and national insurances, were being told they're at risk of being sent back to a place that they weren't really from because they'd been there for so long. And they're British. Their parents had helped build Britain back up, and their life was there in Britain. Now, unfortunately, people were actually starting to be detained and they were being treated like criminals when they weren't. So, this was the Windrush scandal. Their parents who came over in belief they were returning to their mother country to help build Britain back up after a war they'd also had to fight for in Britain. They were then considered being British. Now, these people went to Britain to help build it up. They left their families to go and work. They were not lazy like the British government kept trying to portray. And they, their children had to go through having to prove their rights after all those years, and they were being treated like the bottom of somebody's shoe. The Britain were welcoming white people with open arms, those who are war criminals, people with no skills, who hardly spoke English, over black people who had fought in the war for Britain, had helped build Britain back up. Now that is what you call white privilege.